Serbia, there's a lot of hostility. Actually, were the Iraqis much better at managing the propaganda? And will the Serbians actually mismanage the propaganda? And that'll be perhaps one of the more interesting sidelines to this little conflict.
Then we have the picture of the
assumed Tomahawk.
I mean,
yes,
it could be an assumed Tomahawk missile. Couldn't it?
Yes.
There could be cars that seem to be quite oblivious of its arrival. Never mind. Let's bring ourselves up.
52 bomber returning to base there. You may remember, if you were with us at the top of the hour, that we were showing some video of 2 B-52 bombers coming in a little earlier. Waiting to speak to us is our reporter Andrew Moore. Keep us up to date if you would, Andrew, or bring us up to date. How many of these B-52s have returned now?
About an hour ago, two B-52 bombers returned to the base here at Fairford. We were told that those 2 were on a training mission and returned unscathed. About an hour ago, it was confirmed that the B-52s from this base had been involved in air raids over Serbia, though the spokesman couldn't confirm whether cruise missiles were on board. We're just seeing now through the perimeter fence and through the trees the lights of this large plane coming down. I would assume this is a B-52. When it comes nearer, I will be able to hear the distinctive drone of the engines.
Do we expect that any further information will be released about what these B-52s were involved in?
Yes, we're expecting there will be a press facility here at the base within an hour, an opportunity to talk to the crews and to film the planes coming in. And I can now hear the plane. Perhaps you can hear some of the sound. This is the distinctive sound of the B-52.
Of course, similarly, Andrew, we don't know when they will take off again for further action.
No, we don't know. We may hear a little more this evening. This obviously is the first phase of the air raids. The first indication, really, that air raids were going to happen over Serbia. The planes took off from this base nearly 10 hours ago. Obviously, they didn't head straight there and launch their missiles. They must have been loitering with intent, just waiting somewhere, refueling possibly in midair, waiting for the order to strike.
From 11 o'clock this morning until they've returned.
This is Aviano now. Pictures, fresh pictures, although not live, as you can see. That is a stealth bomber, isn't it?
That's F-117 stealth fighter taking off there. That looks like an F-15E Strike Eagle, twin-seater, converted from a fighter into a long-range strike. That's probably Dusk, one of the F-117s, heading into hangar. Another F-15. You've got a very large American wing at Aviano. Nowadays, the Americans package all their task forces with a few of these type of aircraft, a few of that, so they have a balanced force.
It was thought, wasn't it, the operation would have started perhaps a day or so ago, but the weather's been bad, hasn't it?
The weather over
Some of these planes can cope with it, some can't.
Well, some of them can't, including the stealth fighter, which has very bad performance when it's very cloudy. And the other problem is if the cloud is low, you can't see the target, and your laser to guide the bombs won't go through the cloud. You're in a bit of trouble.
But the trusty old B-52...
The stealth bomber cannot be detected by radar, is that correct?
It can. Both stealth fighter and stealth bomber, there's been a great piece of propaganda by the US Air Force that their aircraft are invisible to radar. They are not. They are just a lot less visible. During the Gulf War, Royal Navy ships were picking up the stealth fighter at about 150 miles. Several French radars in Iraqi service were locating stealth fighters at 50 to 60 miles. The US Department of Defense will tell you those figures are not true, but I know who I believe.
Would the radar have to be particularly sophisticated, or any old radar?
Actually, the Russians were developing anti-stealth radars back in the 1960s. They have deployed them. There is a serious risk that some of the systems the Yugoslavs have in service, there were reports 2 years ago they were tweaking and tuning them with Western electronics to make them specifically anti-stealth radars.
Well, they've taken out this radar installation in Montenegro, haven't they? Is that a particular threat to them?
I would say it's important. The radar outside the Montenegrin capital of Podgorica, the furthest forward radar the Yugoslav armed forces have. It faces Italy. You could almost, with a radar of its size, spot Allied aircraft as they took off from southern Italy, including the base where the RAF Harriers are.
And already knew
that at this moment NATO air operations
against targets in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia have started. In the last months, the international community has spared no efforts to achieve a negotiated solution in Kosovo. But it has not been possible. Clear responsibility for the airstrikes lies with President Milosevic.
These pictures from Yugoslav television are said to show the first cruise missiles flying over Pristina. Targets around the capital Belgrade and in northern Serbia were also attacked, as was an army military barracks in Montenegro. The Serb army claimed there were casualties, but have given no numbers. Earlier in the day, the Yugoslav president effectively ruled out any chance for peace. Milosevic, defiant to the last, rejected NATO's ultimatum. "We will defend our country," he pledged.
This is a question of the freedom of our whole country, and Kosovo and Metohija would be the doorway through which the foreign troops would enter and jeopardize this highest of values.
Reinforcing this message, state television broadcast military footage aimed at bolstering the morale of a worried nation, only now beginning to understand what lies ahead. In Kosovo during the day, Serb troops took advantage of the last hours before the airstrikes to continue their sweep through the villages south of Pristina, burning more homes and repositioning their forces. If any justification was needed for the strike against Serbia, NATO military planners will point to scenes like these. In the last few days, more than 30,000 people have fled their homes. Thousands more are expected to join them, terrified of Serb reprisals following the airstrikes. Tonight, the B-52s arrived back at their base in southern England. All 8 returned safely after launching their cruise missiles in the opening salvo of this first attack. Peter Sharp, Sky News.
Within minutes of the start of the action, the Prime Minister and President Clinton made statements aimed at justifying what NATO's doing tonight. Mr. Blair said the action had to be taken to stop innocent civilians being killed by the Serbs. Moscow is still deeply unhappy. It's cut off cooperation with NATO and called an emergency UN Security Council meeting.
After months of discussion among the Allies over the fate of Kosovo, this time there was no bluffing as the B-52s took to the air. In Berlin at a Euro summit, Mr. Blair gave the reasons for action.
We are a peaceful people who take no joy in war. But we know from our own history and from our own character that there are times when we have to stand up and fight for peace.
But there is not unanimity over NATO's attacks on Serbia. Russia has called an emergency session of the UN Security Council. On Russian television, President Yeltsin said NATO's action had no legal backing. NATO strikes will come in 3 waves. First, from the Adriatic, Tomahawk cruise missiles have already been launched at Serb air defense installations and other military units. Submarines, including HMS Splendid, were involved. B-52 bombers also launched their missiles. If these strikes fail to persuade Milosevic to accept the NATO accord, RAF Harriers, Italian Tornadoes and other jets will launch laser-guided bombs on 300 key targets. These attacks are designed to cripple Serbia's military infrastructure around Kosovo. Finally, 28,000 NATO peacekeeping troops could be brought in to monitor the situation, but only if Milosevic's military capability has been demolished.
Got all of our people back home safely. That's always the #1 goal. They went out, they did their jobs, they did it in a professional manner, and they all came home safely. So they went out in a very somber, focused mood. They came back and they're happy to have gotten the job done.
Can you give us any more details about what that job was?
Well, you know, they were launched earlier this morning, just before lunchtime, to fly down south and participate in the NATO operation in the strikes in the Yugoslav region. They did that. They went down. They had about a 10-hour flight, and they successfully employed their weapons and made it back home. And everybody is very thankful for that. What kind of targets were they hitting? Well, what I understand is that they normally try to go after early on in an operation like this. You want to take out any of the threats to the aircraft, and so what I understand is normally early on you would try to go after surface-to-air missile sites and things like that that are a threat to all the Allied aircraft.
What response was there, if any, from the Yugoslav forces?
Well, you know, I don't really have access to any of that information yet. It's early on, and I honestly have not gotten any of that feedback yet.
Can you tell us what kind of payload your planes were carrying?
No, I'm sorry, I can't.
And the men tonight will be preparing for another 40, will they?
Well, I don't know. You know, we just got back, and we're doing all the debriefs, checking the condition of the jets, making sure all our people are okay, making sure the jets are still flyable and are in tip-top shape, and that's really what we're focused on now. Any future operations would obviously be a political decision and would come down through the NATO chain of command.
Will you use the same crew again on the next mission, or will the crews change?
Well, you know, we've got a finite number of crews here from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. It's quite possible that we would use some of the same crews if we were to go again.
Major Mark Phillips at RAF, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Pentagon information on the nighttime raids was sketchy, except that targets were hit throughout the country and that the strikes would continue as long as necessary.
We are attacking the military infrastructure that President Milosevic and his forces are using to repress and kill innocent people. NATO forces are not attacking the people of Yugoslavia. They are attacking the military forces that are responsible for the killing and the carnage in Kosovo.
U.S. B-52s launched satellite-guided cruise missiles at Serb targets. Others were fired from U.S. ships and a British submarine in the Adriatic. Several dozen were expected to be launched on the first day of action. The main targets were military barracks, radar sites, and command and control centers. The chairman of the Military Joint Chiefs, General Hugh Shelton, explained the early mission focus and offered a stark reminder.
The air defense system in Yugoslavia is very capable, and it poses a considerable threat to NATO aircraft involved in the operation. And although at this point we have no indication of casualties to U.S. or NATO forces, we're continue to take all measures to reduce the risk to our pilots and air crews. But there's no such thing as a risk-free military operation.
Involved in the first day's air action, dispatched from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, a pair of U.S. B-2 stealth bombers. The first combat mission ever for those $2 billion aircraft that are virtually invisible to radar. Each can drop as many as 16 satellite-guided 2,000-pound bombs. Secretary Cohen says they performed according to their capabilities. No details. A senior military official here says there is high confidence that 2 Serb MiG fighter jets were downed by NATO aircraft today. When he briefed journalists a few hours ago, Defense Secretary William Cohen said there had been some air-to-air combat. He gave no details, but he said all NATO crews were safe. Joey?
Gene, is there any perspective from the Pentagon? There had been some early speculation that the forces in Yugoslavia would have the capacity and would certainly seek to go after the aircraft. Some sort of surface-to-air missile attack might be in the offing, and yet this did not seem to be part of the early wave of response from Yugoslavia. Is there any understanding why that might be, and does that change the strategy at all from the Pentagon's point of view?
You know, Joey, we just don't know at this point. We hope to hear a lot more about the details of what happened today and what did not happen today when we hear from NATO headquarters tomorrow in Brussels.
Your assessment of how things went on this first day?
Well, right now, as you know, Joey, it's still going on, but from speaking with folks over at the Pentagon and some NATO folks, I think NATO and the U.S. Are pleased with what they've seen so far. It's too early to give any bomb damage assessment, mostly because of the cover of darkness. But as long as all of the planes are returning safely, and in fact they're hitting most of the targets that they were looking at, or at least they think they have, I think they're ready to call it a successful day.
Certainly from Washington's perspective, the importance that all the aircraft return safely on their first mission. General, if we could talk about some of the early speculation was that Yugoslavia did have the forces, the surface-to-air missiles, the ability to enforce some sort of strong mount, at least a strong campaign against any NATO aircraft flying overhead and bringing in these bombs. And yet this did not seem to be a big part of the first response from Yugoslavia. Is there a perspective on why this might have been the case?
No, it's mostly speculation right now, Joey. In talking with the folks, they're kind of surprised that surface-to-air missiles did not come up at them as some of those manned aircraft went across Kosovo. There's still some surprise. They think that perhaps they thought that by sending up maybe the MiG-29s and MiG-21s, that they might be the first threat that the incoming aircraft would face, and that they were going to husband their resources. NATO and U.S. forces, I think, were a little bit surprised that there wasn't heavy anti-aircraft, but I wouldn't be overly optimistic that that might not greet those that are coming in subsequent waves.
Can you talk a bit about the targets that were selected for the early waves?
Well, from obviously limited knowledge, because that's an operational issue, essentially they were going after, first I think they wanted to look at the tactical and shape the battlefield, so to speak, so that around Kosovo, the province of Kosovo, they wanted to make sure that they were starting to take down that warfighting capability that Milosevic's forces have used against the people on the ground down there. At the same time, they were going out strategically and looking at some things up around Belgrade and other parts of Yugoslavia to try and make sure that they kept them from sustaining and keeping the effort going in the province. So it was a countrywide attack, mostly through the use of cruise missiles, both sea-launched and air-launched, and also there were some mixed NATO packages going out there that took on some of the air defense systems themselves.
And we note here, we're just looking at the pictures of the Tomahawk. We note here a report from CNN's Martin Savage a moment ago saying that 3 more had just been launched from the ship, the USS Philippine Sea, which he is on board. General, if we could talk a little bit further about that distinction that you made. We certainly understand that in these early waves, there would be an effort to bring out the forces against the ability of Yugoslavia to strike back against the NATO aircraft. But in a longer range, and perhaps there was some sort of message being sent, some of the targets seem to be a little bit different. I read in some cases an aircraft factory, a munitions factory, had also apparently been targeted. Obviously, this is rather early and sketchy information, but this would be sort of in the long-range ability of Yugoslavia to maintain action against the NATO forces.
Well, it would be speculating on my part. I think your point's well taken, Joey, but I think that probably what they're doing is sending a message and saying that not only are we going after those strictly military targets, but also the capability, the infrastructure capabilities that you have that you can use against NATO forces, and more importantly, use to sustain the effort down in the province. So I think, a province, I should say. So I think there is a real thoughtful application by NATO and U.S. planners as to how do we send a message. And looking at the targets that we have seen that have been hit, that have been reported to us, it would indicate to me that they're not just doing a one-dimension battlefield, but in fact they are reaching out and going both at the strategic and at the tactical level.
General Richard Neal, we appreciate your joining us.
We act to protect thousands of innocent people in Kosovo from a mounting military offensive. We act to prevent a wider war, to defuse a powder keg at the heart of Europe that has exploded twice before in this century with catastrophic results. And we act to stand united with our allies for peace. By acting now, we are upholding our values, protecting our interests, and advancing the cause of peace.
In the next hour, we'll look at the NATO operation in and around Kosovo, with reports from CNN correspondents in several continents. The airstrikes of Operation Allied Force, as it's called, began after waves of stealth bombers and fighter planes took off, many from Aviano, Italy. As those planes dropped bombs, flashes of light lit the night sky over Belgrade and Pristina. But first, we take you to the White House, where a few hours ago, President Clinton again laid out the case for airstrikes against Yugoslavia. CNN senior White House correspondent Wolf Blitzer reports.
Repeatedly referring to events that led to World Wars I and II and the Holocaust, President Clinton went on national television to justify why NATO allies have attacked Yugoslavia.
In both wars, Europe was slow to recognize the dangers, and the United States waited even longer to enter the conflicts. Just imagine if leaders back then had acted wisely and early enough. How many lives could have been saved? How many Americans would not have had to die?
He says Yugoslavia's President Slobodan Milosevic understands only one thing: force.
Right now, our firmness is the only hope the people of Kosovo have.
And he delivered this warning.
If President Milosevic will not make peace, we will limit his ability to make war.
Using maps, Mr. Clinton cited the 3 objectives of the NATO mission.
To demonstrate the seriousness of NATO's purpose, so that the Serbian leaders understand the imperative of reversing course. To deter an even bloodier offensive against innocent civilians in Kosovo. And if necessary, to seriously damage the Serbian military's capacity to harm the people of Kosovo.
He says the U.S. has a vital national interest to maintain stability in the heart of Europe.
All the ingredients for a major war are there. Ancient grievances, struggling democracies, and in the center of it all, a dictator in Serbia who has done nothing since the Cold War ended but start new wars and pour gasoline on the flames of ethnic and religious division.
The president spent most of the day meeting with his top national security advisors and calling the bipartisan congressional leadership. White House officials say they were encouraged by the response, but remain deeply worried that U.S. casualties or a prolonged conflict could quickly erode that support. President Clinton canceled a 3-day political fundraising trip to remain in Washington to monitor the NATO operation. Aides say they don't expect President Milosevic to accept the terms of any peace agreement anytime soon, meaning the bombing could continue for days. Judy?
Wolf, does the president, the people around the president, feel in effect they're playing catch-up in having to explain this now to the American people?
Reluctantly, they acknowledge, yes, they do, that they tried to make the case, they say earlier, but insist that very few people were listening. President Clinton yesterday spent a half hour talking about the national interest in going to war against Yugoslavia. Today he did it on national television. But some of the president's own supporters and advisors will acknowledge this is coming a little bit late in the process. They probably should have done a better job early on preparing the American public for this contingency.
All right, Wolf Blitzer reporting from the White House. Thanks. There are reports that a military airport near the Yugoslav capital of Belgrade was hit, as well as a nearby weapons factory. CNN's Chris Burns was in Yugoslavia earlier in this day and has been following the damage reports. He joins us now from neighboring Macedonia, a country also affected by the crisis in Kosovo. Chris, tell us what you were seeing while still in Yugoslavia.
Right, Judy, when we were there, we were leaving just a few hours before the bombing began, but hours later, just after nightfall at around 8 o'clock, Pristina was attacked. The Pristina area was attacked, and you're seeing some of that image, some of the first image, the video that we caught shooting out from the window. We saw in the direction generally of the army barracks, and so that was most likely one of the targets of that attack. A broad attack throughout Kosovo and the rest of Serbia. Other possible targets in the area were a radar station, a transmission station near Pristina, and other military targets. The explosions, the sounds of explosions came repeatedly, fast and furious. It's really the indication of a very, very, very fierce attack. There was quite a bit of damage around Pristina as a result. What is difficult to say is what exactly was hit, and neither side, neither the NATO nor the Yugoslav government is saying exactly how much and exactly how things were hit. We will find out when dawn breaks. At this hour, we can only see from the images that we see from the initial damage that it is very intense and it is widespread. To the north, in the Belgrade area, the damage was also widespread. The government is saying that an arms factory was hit and a radar site. This all falls in line with the objectives of NATO to strike at command and control, as well as other military sites, bases, and so forth. Of course, in these attacks, there's always the danger of what's called collateral damage, that is civilians wounded or killed in the attack, and Belgrade television was broadcasting some of the victims in a hospital, showing that, yes, there were some people who were hit, and that is going to be an issue.